Vel should have sent the alert the moment Ambassador Ilara Thorn touched 2 fingers to the stone rail. The gesture itself meant nothing to anyone else in the Hall of Accord. Around him, the ceremony on Kareth Prime continued with all the polished grandeur the coalition had perfected across centuries of diplomacy. Beneath the crystal dome, 6 civilizations watched humanity accept provisional standing with measured dignity, and the sanctuary's white fire bathed every face in the same soft, impartial light. The warning glyph on the outer shield display had flickered once and vanished. A minor fluctuation. A forgettable thing. But Trin had spent 17 years building a career on the truth that empires did not collapse because of obvious signals. They collapsed because one small irregularity was mistaken for coincidence until it attached itself to something too large to survive. And the humans had reacted. Not loudly. Not in panic. That was what made it worse. No startled glances. No whispered consultation. No visible break in composure. Ambassador Thorn had continued speaking about trust, mutual passage, and the necessity of meeting the unknown with open hands instead of armed suspicion, and every word had been elegant enough to quiet the room. Yet in the instant the sanctuary's systems trembled, every human in the delegation had shifted in exactly the same subtle way, as if a silent answer had arrived to a question only they had known to ask. By the time the rest of the chambers settled into approval and diplomatic warmth, Trin was no longer listening to the speech. He was watching posture, timing, breath, eyes, the things that never lied when language still had room to pretend. The reception afterward only deepened the problem. Humanity should have looked relieved. They had just been given corridor access, exchange status, and the first true step into coalition legitimacy. Any species on the edge of acceptance would have shown gratitude sharpened by vulnerability. The humans showed something else. Satisfaction, certainly, but not dependence. Not one of them carried the loosened tension of people whose fate had been decided by others. They moved through the observatory gallery as if the outcome had been expected, not hoped for, and Jonah Mercer, the smiling cultural attaché with the harmless notebook and the easy laughter, seemed especially at home in that certainty. When Trin finally asked him what he was expecting, Mercer's answer came with the same warm composure that had charmed half the room. "The trouble with analysts," he said, glancing not at the stars beyond the observatory glass but at their reflection, "is that eventually you notice other people noticing." Hours later, alone in the archive vaults, Trin matched the ceremony timestamp to a buried systems note from the sanctuary's lower sensor spine and felt the room turn cold around him. The mass echo had not appeared after the gesture. It had appeared with it. And if the timing meant what he feared it meant, then humanity had not arrived at Kareth Prime asking for trust. They had arrived already protected by something hiding in the dark. To be why second watch the sanctuary had gone quiet in the way only diplomatic stations ever did, with silence layered over machinery, ceremony, and guarded intentions until even the air felt curated. Kareth Prime never truly slept. Its corridors dimmed, its public halls emptied, and its service drones lowered their profiles to respectful invisibility, but beneath the aesthetic stillness ran 1,000 controlled systems and 1,000 more controlled secrets. Vel moved through them with authorization on his slate and unease in his spine, following the cold trail of a question that had stopped resembling professional curiosity and started feeling personal. The archives granted him what summit access allowed: transit disclosures, cultural briefings, military liaison restrictions, economic summaries, behavioral assessments, and sanitized historical packets prepared for coalition review. He began where caution demanded, not because he expected the answer to be there, but because responsible minds earned their paranoia step by step. Humanity's official file was almost offensively reassuring. Their submission history was punctual. Their diplomatic compliance was near perfect. Inspection requests had been answered within hours. Medical protocols had been shared at a depth most species would have considered reckless. Linguistic frameworks, trade ethics, legal reciprocity models, settlement doctrine, biological hazard classifications, even educational archives had all been offered with a level of openness that made Trin distrust them more, not less. No civilization handed over that much without deciding, very carefully, what kind of confidence it wanted to project. He broadened the query. The first wave of results changed tone only slightly. Human first contact doctrine emphasized de-escalation, cultural patience, redundancy in communication, and extreme investment in misinterpretation control. They had modeled the risks of alien encounter long before the coalition had ever known they existed. Their outreach patterns were not improvisational. They were layered. Their negotiators were trained not simply in protocol, but in emotional variance, symbolic ambiguity, and what one translated document called adverse perception recovery. Turin read that phrase twice. It sounded less like diplomacy than damage control prepared in advance for fear. Then he moved into history, and the reassuring mask began to thin. Human civilization, when plotted in long historical view, did not resemble the orderly rise most coalition species preferred to remember about themselves. It looked jagged, repetitive, inventive in ways that bordered on pathological. They had fractured repeatedly, united repeatedly, nearly destroyed themselves more than once, then spent entire eras building institutions designed to prevent the same failures, only to preserve alongside those institutions elaborate contingency systems for the day prevention failed anyway. Their art mourned war. Their literature dissected it. Their philosophy condemned it, justified it, feared it, and returned to it with obsessive honesty across millennia. Even their entertainment converted catastrophe into rehearsal. They studied collapse the way other species studied agriculture or weather. Turin leaned back from the archive interface and felt something uncomfortable settle into place. The coalition had assumed humanity's warmth was a sign of optimism. It might have been, but it was a trained optimism, one sharpened against historical memory until it became something sturdier than idealism. Humans did not appear peaceful because they believed disaster was unlikely. They appeared peaceful because they had spent centuries learning how expensive disaster became when you mistook calm for safety. A movement near the edge of the reading chamber broke his concentration. He turned too quickly, his nerves already running ahead of him, and found only a service drone gliding along the floor with fresh tea canisters in its recessed carriage. No surveillance team. No security summons. No indication that anyone knew where his thoughts had gone. Still, the interruption left residue. Turin narrowed the privacy field around his terminal and changed the search again. This time he stepped away from public record and toward permitted technical debris, the informational corners bureaucracies created by accident. Maintenance reports. Sensor calibration notes. Outer grid variance logs. Emergency drill reviews. Service channel traffic flagged as low priority. The sort of material that never reached diplomatic summaries because it was too small to matter until it mattered all at once. He found 3 more anomalies in under 11 minutes. The first had occurred 6 hours before the ceremony, a deep field distortion beyond the sanctuary's standard traffic perimeter, dismissed as lensing interference from a solar ghost farther out in system. The second had been a fractional harmonic echo in the shield's skin itself, too slight to trigger alarm, filed as instrumentation drift pending technician review. The third was the note he had already seen from the lower sensor spine, logged by a tired systems worker who had clearly wanted the observation recorded and forgotten. Range impossible. Signature unstable. Probable artifact. By themselves, none of them proved anything. Together, they formed the outline of a lie too shy to announce itself directly. Turin cross-referenced the timings against the human delegation's movement logs. Officially, they matched nothing unusual. The humans had attended all pre-ceremony checks, remained within approved quarters, passed security sweep after security sweep, and observed the summit schedule with almost insulting discipline. Yet when he overlaid the logs with less obvious behavior markers, meal timing deviations, last-minute room changes, calm silences, the brief relocation of a secondary translator team, patterns emerged. Small patterns. Weak patterns. The kind analysts ruined their reputations chasing if they let instinct outrun proof. But instinct had kept him alive in rooms where proof always arrived after the damage. At 1:48 sanctuary time, he froze over a line item so mundane it took his mind a moment to understand why it mattered. Human delegation request, Eastern Observatory access during pre-dawn hours, cultural preference justification approved. The request had been filed and granted the day before arrival. Turin pulled the architectural map of the Eastern Observatory and enlarged the external sightline grid. The aperture looked out across the very quarter of space where the lower spine anomalies had been recorded. The realization did not come as a dramatic flash. It came slowly, sickeningly, like a floor deciding to stop pretending to be solid. The humans had asked for ceremonial placement, then for reception routing, then for an observatory angle that just happened to favor the same empty darkness from which impossible mass echoes kept whispering at the edge of the sanctuary systems. He saved the query packet to a private partition and sat motionless, listening to the low hum of the archive vault. Protocol said he should report now. Protocol also said he should report only what he could substantiate. If he went to security with a handful of correlations, he would trigger noise, not action. Best case, they would tighten observation around the human delegation and alert whoever or whatever might already be watching from outside sensor certainty. Worst case, they would dismiss him as a summit analyst who had mistaken intuition for evidence and never trust his instincts again when the real emergency arrived. He hated that both outcomes felt plausible. The station clock cycled forward. Somewhere above him, behind layered glass and ceremonial stone, the delegates of 6 civilizations slept peacefully inside the myth of a successful welcome. Turin rose, closed the archive slate, and made for the Eastern Observatory. Kareth Prime's inner corridors at that hour belonged to maintenance crews, low-lit patrols, and people whose reasons for movement they did not care to explain. The sanctuary had been designed to produce awe in daylight and discretion after dark. Walls curved with seamless mineral polish. Soft illumination ran like trapped moonlight beneath the floor seams. Open spaces widened without warning into alcoves for art, memory, and quiet negotiation. Turin moved through all of it at a measured pace that concealed the speed of his thoughts. Twice he saw junior envoys returning to quarters after private discussions. Once he passed 2 Halen guards murmuring over a tactical game projected onto their wrist slates. No one stopped him. The Eastern Observatory waited in half-darkness, its great aperture veiled by a transparent night filter that cut glare and sharpened the stars. It was empty except for one figure standing near the rail with both hands folded behind his back. Jonah Mercer did not turn immediately. That unsettled Turin almost more than if he had. It suggested either supreme composure or certainty about who had entered. Analyst Vel, Mercer said at last, still facing the stars. You are developing a habit of finding the least restful parts of the station. Turin remained 3 paces from the threshold. And you are developing a habit of being present before I arrive. That would imply I knew you were coming. You did. Mercer gave a small, regretful tilt of the head that was not quite agreement and not quite denial. In the observatory's reduced light, the charm he wore so easily in public had changed texture. It was still there, but quieter now, less decorative, more functional. Turin had the sudden sense that the smiling cultural attaché from the reception had not been false, only incomplete. The Eastern aperture. Pace with Mercer as they turned into the central transit curve. A vessel? Boarding attempt? Internal sabotage. Mercer touched 2 fingers to the inner side of his wrist, not to activate a visible device, but in the way one acknowledged information arriving through a channel too discreet to advertise. Not sabotage, he said. Too blunt. Not a boarding action yet either. Yet. Mercer glanced at him. If someone wants leverage, they don't start by destroying the room. They start by proving they can reach it. The answer landed with the sick weight of something reasoned in advance. Turin's throat tightened. You expected an attack on the summit. We expected that history might object to being accelerated. That would have sounded evasive from anyone else. From Mercer, under blood-red lighting with station alarms rising by degrees around them, it sounded like a compressed truth too large to unpack while moving. Ahead, the transit curve opened toward a junction overlooking the Hall of Accord. Through the layered glass partitions, Turin could see the sanctuary's central chamber being sealed in sections. Security fields rippled into place over the primary entrances. Delegates were being redirected toward protected alcoves with all the choreography of a system that had practiced this many times and still hoped never to use it for real. He searched automatically for the human delegation. Ambassador Thorne stood near the northern arch, one hand on the shoulder of a startled junior envoy from the Keeler delegation, speaking with measured calm while coalition guards took positions around the chamber. Her expression had not broken. Her posture had not tightened. Even at this distance, even in emergency light, she looked less like a diplomat caught inside a crisis than like a commander discovering the crisis had arrived on schedule. Several of the humans had already shifted into quiet motion around the hall's periphery, not clustering around their own ambassador, but spacing themselves in relation to entrances, sight lines, and the flow of frightened civilians. They were not reacting. They were unfolding. Turin felt the realization harden into fear at last. Every instinct trained into him by diplomacy and coalition logic had assumed the humans' most dangerous quality would be hidden weaponry, concealed warships, a private threat posture wrapped in polite language. But what he was seeing now was stranger and more disturbing. The weapons, whatever they were, had never been the center of the design. The center was the people. The readiness. The practiced shift from warmth to structure without visible emotional lag. Humanity did not become alarming when the facade fell. Humanity became alarming because there had never been a facade in the first place. The warmth had been real. So had the preparation. A tremor ran through the station. It was not violent, not enough to throw anyone off balance, but enough to move dust in the ceiling seams and send a shock through the glass under Turin's hand. Several delegates in the hall below recoiled. One of the outer shield projections flared, vanished, then reappeared in fragmented lines. This time the sanctuary voice sharpened its tone. Outer defensive lattice compromised. Containment protocols active. All rank delegates proceed to protected core routes. The corridor erupted into disciplined movement. Guards began pulling personnel away from the overlook. Administrative aides stumbled into their assignments with terror hidden behind training. Turin turned back toward Mercer and found him standing still for the first time since the alarms began, head inclined slightly, listening to something no one else could hear. Then he spoke, but not to Turin. Confirm trajectory. The pause. Too clean, he said. That means they want the station alive. Turin stared. Who wants the station alive? Mercer looked at him fully now. The softness was gone from his face, though not, strangely, from his voice. A power that cannot attack Earth directly without consequences. A power that can, however, strike the symbol Earth just entered and make 6 other civilizations question whether welcoming us was worth the cost. The logic cascaded through Turin in brutal sequence. Not random aggression. Not piracy. Not ideological terror. Strategic coercion. Someone had watched the coalition summit, understood the timing, and selected Kareth Prime as a message board large enough to force history backward. Humanity's admission into the coalition had not merely made allies. It had redrawn incentives for enemies. Why didn't you tell us? Turin asked, and the question came out harsher than fear alone could explain. If you knew this was possible, if you had reason to believe someone would make a move tonight, why let the summit proceed? Mercer held his gaze. Because cancellation would have told them fear works. Delay would have told them pressure works. Retreat would have told every species in that hall that first contact with humanity begins with concession. The answer was infuriating. It was also, in a way Turin hated, magnificent. Before he could speak again, a different alarm cut through the station's layered tones, sharper, faster, meant for personnel who understood the distinction. Internal perimeter breach. Not physical. Systems intrusion. Somebody was inside the sanctuary network. All along the corridor, sealed doors flashed from red to white to black. Lighting bands strobed. One of the wall displays burst into static, then reassembled itself around a single concentric symbol Turin did not recognize. It remained on screen for less than a second before the system purged it, but the image had the confidence of a signature, not the randomness of corruption. Mercer swore softly under his breath. It was the first crack Turin had seen in him. What was that? Turin asked. A handshake, Mercer said. Or the insult version of one. Then he started moving again, faster now, toward the descending core route that would lead to the protected delegate levels. Trin kept up with difficulty. You know them. We know the pattern. That is not the same thing. No, Mercer said. It usually becomes worse. They descended through a spiral corridor where security bulkheads were sliding into place one segment at a time. Above them the sanctuary architecture still attempted dignity, all curved stone and refracted light, but the effect was collapsing under emergency function. The station had stopped pretending to be a monument and reverted to what it truly was. A fortress built by species who talked about peace because they remembered war. At the second core gate they encountered Ambassador Thorn. She had arrived by a different route with 2 human delegates, 3 coalition guards, and 1 trembling Keeler archivist whom Trin recognized from the reception. The archivist still clutched the tiny human notebook Mercer had passed around hours earlier, as if the absurdity of carrying it through a crisis was the only thread keeping panic from taking hold. Thorn saw Trin at once, and for the briefest moment her eyes gave him the unmistakable look of someone updating a calculation. "Analyst Vel," she said. "You stayed curious." The line might have been dry humor in another context. Here it felt like acknowledgement and warning at once. Trin looked from her to Mercer. "You both knew." "We knew enough to prepare," Thorn replied. "Not enough to predict which pressure point they choose." The core gate began cycling open under triple authorization. Beyond it lay the protected transit spine leading to the delegate refuge chambers and the station's central command tier. Trin expected Thorn to order her people inside first. Instead she turned to the coalition guards. "Take the delegates to command sanctuary and lock the route after them," she said. "No clustering at chamber mouths. No visible bottlenecks. If they're tracking movement density, don't give them one." The guards obeyed. That more than anything else drove home how quickly human authority had inserted itself into the crisis. No debate. No defensive resentment. No species pride. In the presence of competence, institutions made room. The trembling archivist hesitated as the guards guided him forward. "What about you?" he asked Thorn. Her answer was calm enough to feel terrifying. "We're going to make sure this stays a summit." When the gates sealed behind the civilians, the corridor finally belonged to people who understood that the next minutes would decide whether Kareth Prime remained a diplomatic incident or became the first page of a war record. Trin found himself inside that circle before anyone had explicitly invited him there. He almost stepped back out of it, but Mercer stopped him with a glance. "You saw the pattern first," the human said. "You stay." Trin should have refused. Instead he said, "Then stop speaking to me in fragments." For the first time, Ambassador Thorn's composure shifted into something like approval. "Fair enough," she said. "An anti-coalition interdiction bloc has been testing response thresholds along the frontier for months. Not openly. Through proxies, system intrusions, inducements, transport disappearances, political pressure. They prefer ambiguity because ambiguity delays retaliation. Earth entered coalition talks knowing formal recognition would force their hand sooner or later. And tonight is sooner, Trin said. Tonight, Mercer said, is either a demonstration or a capture attempt. The words turned the air colder. Capture? Trin echoed. Thorn nodded once. A station like Kareth Prime is more useful intact than broken. Seize it briefly, hijack the narrative, hold delegates in fear, broadcast coalition weakness, frame Earth as the catalyst that brought instability to a sacred neutral site. You don't need to win militarily. You only need to poison trust. Trin saw it then with horrible clarity. If the sanctuary fell even for an hour, every speech about mutual passage and shared survival would curdle overnight. Humanity would not merely be endangered. It would be politically isolated before its seat had even settled. So the hidden vessel outside, he said, that was your safeguard. Mercer's expression hardened. One of them. Trin stared at him. Mercer did not elaborate, which told him enough. Somewhere out in the dark beyond Kareth Prime was not one quiet human answer, but several. Nested plans. Overlapping contingencies. Protective architecture hidden behind a smiling first contact mission. Humanity had come to the summit exactly as it had spoken to the coalition, open-handed, patient, ready for peace. It had simply refused to define peace as the absence of preparation. A pulse hit the station then, far more violent than the first tremor. The corridor lights burst white, then went dead, then returned in red again. A pressure wave ran through the floor. Above them, something massive moved against the sanctuary's outer defenses with enough force to make the structure groan. Not a test now. A strike. The core wall display flickered to life with an emergency tactical feed. No one had summoned it. That alone was bad. The image resolved into a partial external view of Kareth Prime suspended above the dead world below, silver storms crawling across the planet's night side like veins under skin. And there, where empty space should have remained empty, shapes were appearing by degrees, as if darkness itself were being taught to reflect. 3 vessels. Long, angular, predatory, their hulls distorted by phase masking and sensor-bending skins that had carried them close under the sanctuary's perception threshold. Not war cruisers in the traditional coalition style. Not raider craft either. They looked like instruments built to open a hole in certainty and step through it before language caught up. Tryn heard his own breath change. Mercer watched the tactical feed with no visible surprise. Thorn folded her hands behind her back and studied the ships the way a scholar might study a text she had hoped not to see again. The display tagged the lead vessel with an identifier that flashed only once before system integrity failed. Not coalition recognized. Not in any database Tryn knew. Yet Mercer read it and went very still. What? Tryn asked. Mercer did not answer immediately. When he did, the words arrived with the weight of a door unlocking in the dark. They're not here to threaten the summit, he said. Another impact shook the station. Mercer turned from the screen, and for the first time since the alarms began, genuine urgency overtook even his discipline. They're here for the delegates, he said. And if they take even one alive, this stops being diplomacy. The station should have broken into panic then. That would have been natural. 3 massed vessels appearing at knife range beyond the sanctuary shields, the outer lattice already under assault, the summit delegates sealed inside a neutral monument suddenly recast as hostages waiting to be counted. Every model Tryn had ever studied predicted the same sequence under conditions like these. Civilian fear would spike first. Institutional control would fracture second. Messages would contradict one another. Security would become defensive instead of strategic. A sanctuary built to symbolize peace would begin to die by the oldest law in history. Once enough minds inside a structure believed collapse had started, collapse became easier to finish. That was what should have happened. Instead, the humans moved. It was not dramatic at first. No shouted orders. No heroic declarations. No visible transformation into the kind of cinematic warriors frightened species invented when they needed monsters to explain their defeats. What Tryn saw was worse and, somehow, more astonishing. Ilara Thorn began issuing instructions in the same calm tone she had used to thank the Coalition for corridor access, except now every sentence locked into place inside a larger architecture he could not yet fully see. Jonah Mercer pivoted toward a secondary console, not to seize it, but to redirect its failing tactical feed through a private channel with such practice speed that Tryn understood at once this was not improvisation. The 2 other humans with them moved to opposite junctions without waiting to be told, covering angles, tracking motion, listening to the station the way hunters listen to weather. They looked exactly like they had at the reception, measured, civilized, self-possessed. The only difference was that now Tryn understood those qualities had never been the opposite of danger. They had been its disciplined form. The wall display flickered again and the external feed widened just enough to show the truth taking shape around Kareth Prime. The 3 hostile vessels were not drifting into position for bombardment. They were spreading in a deliberate triangular pattern, pinning the sanctuary between fields of interdiction and boarding geometry. Pulse blooms hammered at the outer shield lattice, not with brute force saturation, but with surgical rhythm, testing frequencies, searching for sympathetic failure points. It was the method of raiders with graduate-level patience, the kind who wanted doors open and systems confused, not rubble. Somewhere in the protected core levels, the coalition delegates still believed they were being evacuated from danger. Turin now understood they were being concentrated into a prize. The realization hit him so hard he nearly spoke it aloud, but Thorn was already there. "They need the summit intact for 10 minutes, she said, eyes on the tactical feed. 12 at most. Long enough to breach, isolate, extract, and broadcast. After that the station becomes expendable." Mercer finished routing the signal and a second set of contacts flashed into existence beyond the attacker's perimeter. Smaller. Darker. So subtle the sanctuary systems had failed to classify them at first. Turin felt his pulse stumble. More ships. No, not ships in the coalition sense. They moved too cleanly for that, like ideas translated into metal. Their emissions were controlled to the point of absence. Their silhouettes held low profiles, functional curves, shieldless on paper and somehow more dangerous for it. They had been there all along, beyond the edge of obvious detection, not massed like a fleet announcing power, but threaded through the dark in positions of mutual support. Humanity had not hidden one guardian in the void. Humanity had hidden a response web. Mercer exhaled once, and for the first time the tension in him eased instead of sharpening. "They held discipline," he murmured, almost to himself. Turin stared. "Those are yours." "They were always ours." The simplicity of the answer did something violent to Turin's understanding of scale. The coalition had welcomed a new species into shared space with all the ceremony of senior powers granting admission to a hopeful subordinate. And all the while humanity had approached not like supplicants, nor like opportunists, but like a civilization already accustomed to carrying its own survival architecture anywhere symbolism might attract a blade. Their openness had never depended on anyone else's shield. The hostile vessels reacted almost at once. Their formation tightened. New energy signatures bloomed along the sanctuary's outer perimeter. One of the massed ships peeled downward, committing to the breach. The tactical display flooded with warnings, then stabilized again as Mercer's rerouting forced useful information through collapsing channels. Turin watched the geometry update in terrifying elegance. Boarding vectors. Decoy drives. Electronic spikes against sanctuary command nodes. Every line on the screen said the same thing in a different language. The enemy had come to take living leverage from a room full of history. A tone sounded at Mercer's wrist. This time it projected audibly enough for the corridor to hear, and a human voice, clipped and steady, emerged through static. Outer screen element 2 in contact. No penetration. Interceptors holding. We have hostile insertion pods massed behind the lead hull. Mercer replied without hesitation. Predicted. Break the pods before release or force hard drift away from station spin. Understood. The channel cut. Turin swallowed. Somewhere outside the sanctuary, beyond walls built to make war feel distant and abstract, human crews were already fighting in the dark with the kind of precision that made the entire station's fate feel balanced on decisions too fast for fear to track. Yet even then Thorn's attention was not on the external battle. It was on the station itself. "They still have an internal route," she said. Turin turned sharply. "You said the breach was a systems intrusion." "I said that was the first move." She looked at the core map, then at the sealed transit spine behind them. No one builds an operation like this around a single method. If the outer assault fails to deliver a clean boarding corridor, the internal asset activates. That symbol in the network was not just a taunt. It was a key turning in an old lock. Something cold moved through Turin. "There is someone on the station." Mercer met his eyes. Not someone. A prepared failure point. Could be code, could be hardware, could be a compromised maintenance node placed cycles ago under a shell contractor 2 governments removed. This kind of operation feeds on institutions that believe neutrality makes them invisible. And there it was again, that infuriating human habit of making criticism sound like tragedy instead of contempt. Turin almost argued, almost defended the sanctuary and every coalition principle it represented, but the argument died before it formed. He had spent his entire career studying behavior under pressure. He knew the look of a false comfort the moment it failed. Neutrality had protected Kareth Prime from flags. It had not protected it from relevance. A violent metallic boom rolled up through the station. Not from outside. From below. The corridor lights flickered, and this time the tactical map split its attention between external combat and an internal surge racing through service levels toward the delegate refuge chambers. Security teams were converging, but the path was too clean, too direct. Somebody had found a route past ceremonial architecture and straight into the sanctuary's vascular system. Thorn turned to the coalition guards remaining at the junction. Lock every civilian chamber and break network trust between them. Manual confirmation only. No remote unlocks. The senior guard hesitated just long enough to reveal the thought beneath it. Those routes are protected. Mercer's answer came like a blade wrapped in silk. So was the sky. That ended the hesitation. The guards ran. Turin heard his own breathing, felt the thud of his pulse in his throat, and realized with a strange detached clarity that the story of this night had already escaped diplomacy. If the enemy took the delegates, the coalition would fracture around fear and accusation. If the humans saved them, every species in the alliance would have to re-evaluate what humanity truly was. Either way, history was already moving. The only question left was whether it would move under terror or under defiance. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, surprising himself with how steady he sounded. Mercer looked at him as if reassessing a variable that had changed shape under pressure. "You still want to observe?" "No," Turin said, and the honesty in it felt almost cleansing. "Now I want to help." Something like approval passed between Mercer and Thorn. "Good," Thorn said. "Then be useful the way analysts are useful. Think like the people who built this. Where would a sanctuary hide a route that everyone trusted enough not to inspect closely?" The question struck sparks through Turin's fear. He turned to the core schematic, not as a frightened civilian now, but as the thing he had trained all his life to be. He looked past the ceremonial labels and public geometry and into service logic, redundancies, power balancing, and aesthetic concessions that engineers made when architecture had to pretend not to be infrastructure. Kareth Prime's protected routes were famous, published, politically sacred. That made them ideal distractions. The real vulnerability would lie where no diplomat ever looked because looking would ruin the illusion. His finger landed on a maintenance transfer line threading beneath the memory galleries and feeding into archival preservation vaults. Non-critical on public maps. Minimally staffed during summit hours. Shielded from broad-spectrum scans to protect fragile storage media from interference. A perfect blind artery leading toward the refuge spine. "There?" he said. "If they seeded a path years ago, it would be there." Mercer was already moving before the final word left Turin's mouth. "That's the route." What followed later refused to sit neatly inside memory. Turin would remember flashes, sounds, emotional temperatures, but not the entire sequence in order. He would remember racing through the lower corridor with emergency lights painting the walls red and gold, Mercer ahead of him with impossible calm and the two other humans peeling outward at intersections as if they could feel the shape of danger before it appeared. He would remember the first burst of weapons fire in the preservation hall. Not prolonged, not chaotic, but brutally short, the kind of violence that ended before panic had fully decided what form to take. He would remember the enemy operative they found at the maintenance gate, not an invading squad in parade armor, but a compact insertion team already deep in the station, faceless behind adaptive visors, moving with the confidence of professionals who had expected empty corridors and found humanity instead. He would remember, most of all, the speed of human adaptation. The first hostile shot took a chunk from the preservation arch above Mercer's head. The human did not flinch backward. He moved into the angle of it, saw the pattern, and redirected his own people without visible pause. One of the enemy tried to fall back and seal the gate. Thorn crossed open ground that no diplomat should ever have crossed under fire, reached the manual override housing, and ripped the panel free with her bare hands while a human guard covered the corridor. Another hostile attempted to use the archive canisters as collateral leverage. Turin saw the calculation happen in Mercer's face before it happened in motion. No rage. No theater. Just cold, instant prioritization, followed by a response so precise the operative dropped before the threat fully existed. The whole exchange could not have lasted long. Long enough, however, for Trun to understand the final truth he had been circling all night. Humanity's greatness was not that it loved violence. It did not. The evidence was everywhere in the discipline, the restraint, the way every human action bent first toward protection and only then toward destruction. Humanity's greatness was not even that it prepared for disaster. Many species did that. What set them apart was that when disaster finally arrived, they did not need to become something else to meet it. They remained themselves, thinking, feeling, frightened, furious, compassionate, and astonishingly controlled, and then used all of it at once. The maintenance gate gave way. Beyond it lay the last approach to the delegate refuge chambers, and beyond that the future of the coalition itself. Trun expected more enemy operatives. He expected blood, wreckage, unbearable noise. Instead he found the route already held. Coalition guards stood at the chamber mouth in shaken formation, and between them and the sealed delegate doors lay two more hostile bodies and one human security officer bleeding through the shoulder while calmly instructing a medic on how to save time with the bandage seal. The officer looked up as Mercer and Thorn arrived and gave the smallest nod, as though this entire sequence had been difficult, inconvenient, and still fully within the range of expected outcomes. "Route secure," the officer said. They were 8 seconds from the inner locks. 8 seconds. That was all. 8 seconds from a captured summit, from live broadcast fear, from the collapse of trust into blame and strategic retreat. 8 seconds from history learning the wrong lesson about first contact. Mercer crouched beside the wounded officer, checked the seal, and pressed one hand briefly to the human's uninjured shoulder before rising again. The gesture lasted less than a second. It carried more meaning than speeches. Only then did the station begin, truly, to survive. The hostile ships outside broke formation as the hidden human interceptors mauled their insertion vectors and stripped them of timing. Sanctuary Command reasserted itself in layers. Internal breaches collapsed under manual lockdown. Security channels stopped contradicting one another and hardened into structure. Behind the sealed doors, the coalition delegates remained alive, frightened, and untouched. The summit had not fallen. The message had not been rewritten. Humanity had come under threat, and instead of bringing chaos to the coalition, it had held the line that kept chaos out. In the long minutes after, when medics took over and command staff flooded corridors that no longer belonged to them alone, Trun watched the humans change again. Not into victors. Not into boastful saviors. Into people carrying the cost of what had nearly happened and setting it down just enough to keep functioning. One leaned against a wall for 3 silent breaths before returning to work. Another checked twice on a coalition guard who had frozen during the firefight, not with mockery, but with practical reassurance. Mercer finally let his shoulders lower a fraction and stared at the sealed delegate doors as if measuring the weight of an outcome denied. Thorn closed her eyes for one heartbeat, opened them, and began speaking with Sanctuary Command as though the last quarter hour had merely been an ugly amendment to an otherwise important evening. Trun understood then why the humans had frightened him from the beginning. They did not pretend fearlessness. They simply refused to grant fear final authority. Later, when the station lights returned to white and the first delegates emerged alive to witness the shape of what had been prevented, Kareth Prime looked different. Not ruined. Not diminished. If anything, more honest. The sanctuary had been tested and revealed for what monuments always were beneath ceremony. Promises that survived only when someone, somewhere, was willing to defend them. Trun stood beneath the crystal dome once more as dawnless starlight washed the hall in pale silver. Humanity's speaking seat had not been removed. It had become impossible to imagine removing it now. The coalition would argue, investigate, accuse, negotiate, and try to fit the night into all the old political containers. Some would resent what humanity had hidden. Some would fear what humanity had revealed. But none of them would be able to say Earth had entered the coalition as a burden. Earth had entered it as a warning to those who still believed civility and readiness could not live inside the same species. Mercer paused beside him on the way back toward command and, for a moment, the old warmth returned in full. You were right not to report too early, he said. Turin looked at him. That sounds dangerously like praise. It is, Mercer replied. Try not to let it ruin you. Then he moved on, leaving Turin beneath the dome with the aftermath, the truth, and the strange steadiness that sometimes followed terror when terror had failed to win. For the first time since the ceremony began, Turin Vale no longer wondered what humanity was hiding. He understood. Humanity did not cross the stars hoping peace would protect it. Humanity crossed the stars prepared to protect peace.